So Jayne Fleener, PhD, so doctor, Dean and Professor Emerita, North Carolina State University, is an active participant in several TSA lodges, including ours, and study groups, including ours. Thank you. And is facilitating one of the virtual study centers, a new initiative of the Theosophical Society in America. And she's an impressive, smart person. And so I'm going to hand it off to you, and then you can start your PowerPoint, and I'm going to mute myself. Thank you, Jayne, for being here.
Really enjoy sort of meeting with you on off days for some studies, and so I feel really comfortable with this lodge and with all of you, and it is really impressive that your history goes back to HPB. I mean, that really is impressive. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and awesome, the other thing came up as well. So now I can't see hands or the chat, but feel free to put questions, comments as I go along in the chat. Because we're recording this, I'm going to ask you to hold off on questions until we sort of get to the end. But again, as we're going through, if you want to throw some things in the chat so we can go back and look at those and remember them, that would be great. So I have been thinking about time for a long time. And I remember in 5th grade, I was sitting in math class and I clicked my fingers and I thought, oh, that'll never happen again. And I clicked my fingers again, oh, that'll never happen again. And I spent the whole math class thinking about the fact that those moments will never happen again. And what does that mean? And what permanence is there if every moment goes away and evaporates immediately? So I've been thinking about time for, as long as I can remember. Certainly as an educator, ideas of transformation, people, how do people transform? How do they learn? Or what kind of learnings are transformational and not transformational? And as a futurist, what are people's relationship with the future and with time, and how do they accommodate all of that? So I've been thinking about time for a long time, so to speak. So some of the questions I want to answer in this presentation are, first of all, what is time? And how do our conceptions of time shape our reality and actions? How and why do we prepare for the future? The why questions are always the most interesting, by the way. So what are our theosophical futures and perspectives of time? What are our pathways to transformation in preparation for the future? And what is the future of humanity? So we're going to cover a lot in a very quick, period of time here, so to speak. So I'm hoping that I don't go too fast, but I do want to try and get a lot of this out. I want to start with this book, Einstein's Dreams. And this is a book I've used both in math classes and in teacher preparation classes. And of course, it's a novel, and the lead person in the novel happens to be a patent clerk in Switzerland in 1905 who has these dreams about time. And every chapter is a different perspective of time. Time is a circle. Time is like the flowing water. Time is, mechanical. Time is finite. Psychological time. So every chapter has a different notion of time. And he explores that notion of time with its relationship to the future and people's responses to it. So, for example, with cyclical time, one person gets this insight that, oh my gosh, this is all time is it repeats itself. And so what I did today, I'm going to do an infinite number of times, and I've already done it an infinite number of times. And the response is hopelessness. Likewise, the world will end oftentimes leads to despair, or mechanical time where You're only judging things on a physical plane. So it's a really interesting book on what is the relationship between our perspectives of time, how that relates to the future, and how we respond to it. Now, in quantum physics, time really disrupted the clockwork universe perspectives of time, the mechanical time that began around the 13th century. So in the 13th century, all of a sudden you had mechanical clocks. And mechanical clocks changed very much how we approached values, how we approached work, how we approached even our living. And we quit being in rhythm with nature. The clocks woke us up. Then quantum time comes on, and quantum time does a lot of interesting things. For one thing, it shows us that observation can absolutely affect our relationships with quote reality and with time. The Schrodinger's cat idea. Quantum entanglement, where you have simultaneity of events at a distance, affects the issues of cause and effect. And cause and effect typically are in a time scale. So if you have simultaneity, time evaporates. Time is no longer a metric of any meaning. And it looks like in a lot of experiments in quantum physics that time itself is an emergent phenomenon, and that rather than really being a basis of reality or what is or what's being studied, it really becomes a property of measurement, a property of observation, a property of participation. So quantum physics has changed also views of time. Bohm, who was a physicist, and Krishnamurti actually had a series of lectures over a period of about 15 years where they looked at time and the relationship between time, people, and in physics. And they developed this, or they talked about, they're not the first ones to talk about this, but they talked very seriously about, well, this psychological time. And that it's our mental projections into the past and future that create a notion of continuity of time. But at the same time, our views of past and future actually fragment our consciousness. And so then they describe the spirit of consciousness as caught in this time-bound process of becoming an accumulation of experiences. And that true transformation, they say, really is when you start to see time as just something that we've created, something that puts limits on thinking, and so therefore they sort of develop this notion of psychological time that becomes something that needs to be transcended. Now, futurists, and I mentioned that I work with a lot of futurists, and they talk about the three tomorrows, and this is how we relate to the future. And the three tomorrows are often functions of the kind of change we're experiencing and our levels of uncertainty. So the further we go out in uncertainty and change, the more we have trouble understanding what the future may hold. So the first tomorrow is what's called the extended present. This is the kind of tomorrow where we can predict things, we optimize things, we make choices to guarantee success and to mitigate potential risks. We're still in a control, sort of orientation. And the idea is that the future is pretty much like the past. And so what we want to do is predict. So examples of the first tomorrow are things like, do I carry an umbrella tomorrow? What experiences have I had that kind of tell me I can carry an umbrella? Or what are my next best moves in playing a game of chess, optimizing my chances of winning? Um, as a student, do I double major in art and physics so that I can maybe get a job? Those are all assuming that the future is going to be pretty much like the past. Now, the next tomorrow is a little bit different because something has changed. A new technology has been introduced, a revolution has occurred, something has happened in the second tomorrow where you have to accommodate because things have changed. The problem is the way you accommodate, you still anticipate that you'll get back to a level where tomorrow is pretty much the same as today. And so, for example, in the familiar futures or tomorrow too, you have things like adapting to new technologies. Um, as an example, in education, with artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and augmented reality, education is scrambling to accommodate, but they're still accommodating without really challenging what does it mean to learn? What should we be learning? Maybe we don't need to learn some things that we've learned in the past. And so they're still creating a familiar tomorrow. They're not really disrupting, what's comfortable. They're just trying to accommodate it. I, of course, find tomorrow 3 the most interesting, the unthought futures. This is where transformative change is required and new narratives across not only mind, but heart and gut need to occur. The future is no longer like the past, and it's unknowable. You can't know it. And now sometimes there are some unthought futures that occur biologically. So, for example, if any of you have a 5-year-old granddaughter or a grandson or something, 4-year-old, and you put out your 3 black checkers and your 3 red checkers, and you say, how many checkers? 3. How many checkers? 3. And are they the same? And they'll say yes. And then you spread out the black ones, and then you say, are they still the same? And they'll say no, that there are more blacks, and you'll have them count it, and they'll count 1, 2, 3, and they'll count 1, 2, 3, but they'll still say there are more blacks because they have not learned to conserve number. But then something magical happens in our brains when we're about 5, and we start to conserve number and volume. And, we understand that a skinny test tube holds less than a big fat cup. And that's a biological thing that happens in our brains. So sometimes the unthought futures are things that are biologically related. Sometimes they're metaphorical, like the heart is a pump. Until the 16th century, people didn't think that about the heart. But because of that metaphor, all of a sudden, people were able to think of the heart in ways that developed whole theories of circulation and so forth. So the 3 tomorrows relate with your perspectives of time and how you react, depending on levels of uncertainty and levels of change. Now, I'm going to real quickly go through some religious and philosophical perspectives just to kind of complicate things. And I'm doing that on purpose because I think when we start talking about the nuances of our relationships about time, there's not a simple answer to it. So, for example, in Taoism really talks about the organic flow or the flowing uncertainty. And they say that what you really need to do is just live in the present. That's the only reality that there is. Confucianism actually ties the future to action today. So the future is shaped by present moral cultivation and social responsibility. Christianity introduced this notion of linear time, and that you have a beginning, God created heaven and earth, and you have an end, the judgment day. And so it's actually not just linear, but it's a line segment. It has a beginning and an end. Now, I'm not a religious scholar, so someone can certainly help me with this, but Islam seems to create time as a ray, not as a segment, because you have the beginning, you have a beginning point, but then at some point in human history, at the day of judgment, there is eternity. And it seems like that's not an end of time, but a continuation of time. In philosophy, these four schools of philosophy are the sort of major Greek schools of philosophy that you really can find at almost every philosophical tradition in the 20th century. 21st century is getting a little more out there, but process philosophy, which is Heraclitus, looked at responses to the future and perceptions of time as perpetual transformation, that stability is an illusion, and that the only real reality is the becoming, the process. Idealism, Plato, and of course Blavatsky really followed a lot of what Plato talked about, because Plato talked about how the physical realm is really just shadow and appearance, and the true reality are the forms that are outside of time. Aristotle was an empiricist, a scientist. He looked at potentiality. Now, this is also something we see in Theosophy, because the notion of potentiality is that you unfold towards your natural end or your nature. So the idea that the acorn's future as an oak tree is inherent in its nature. And that raises the question then, what is our inherent nature? Democritus, another scientific sort of view, still talked about becoming as reality, but was very deterministic. Now, Hinduism, I'm actually showing the complexity in Hinduism because Hinduism captures multiple perspectives of time, and a lot of Theosophy builds on Hinduism. So in Hinduism, you have cyclical time, you have recursive time, you have time beyond time, and you have timelessness. And the cyclical time is the stuff that when we're reading Theosophy and we look at, 7 times 7 times 7 times 7 times 7 times whatever, and we get up to billions of years and we go, oh my gosh, how can we even think about that? There's these huge cyclical time and cosmic cycles, and it makes it hard to discern as humans when we think about how we should act today, how we fit into that kind of cyclical time. Reincarnation and karma brings it down a little bit and creates what's called recursive time. Now, when you recurse, you don't go back to the same point. You go back to a new point and a new point. And so there's still a cyclical nature here, but you're advancing according to what you've accomplished in previous lifetimes. And it's also driven by a moral law or cause and effect. And so your dharma then is played out. And again, you kind of see the Greek philosophers coming in here. There is a determinism here, but it's not a set determinism. Liberation, moksha, is when you actually get liberated from the cycle of rebirth. And this is where the Hindus describe time as being transcended, and you become part of the eternal. And then in the Vedantic tradition, because of course there are multiple Hindu traditions, but in the Vedantic tradition, the ultimate reality is timeless and unchanging. So I wanted to present the multiple depths and perspectives of Hinduism because they really fit nicely into a theosophical worldview. And that's, of course, by design. And so this is from the Mahatma Letters, Mahatma Letter 66 in the chronological version. And when I first saw this, I was just blown away because here was, this picture that was drawn 150 years ago, 140 years ago, and it describes this time evolution across these seven globes. And you can see, let me see if my pointer works. You can see the globes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And
Yes.
in these globes, there's this descending arc from less spiritual to more material till you get to this point, which, by the way, coincidentally, is where we are. And we start then this ascension where we become more spiritual, less physical, and more ethereal. And so the spirit involves or descends into matter, it becomes denser, more material, then evolves back towards spirit, becoming progressively more conscious and more refined. Now, I realize this is hard to really see, so I kind of blew it up. And this is the fourth globe. So let me come back again. So this globe right here, this globe right here is the fourth globe, the Earth globe. And I blew that up to kind of see the in the fourth globe, we're in the fourth round. We're in the fifth root race. So 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth root race. We're in the 5th to 7th sub race, moving towards the 6th root race here. Now, for those of you who aren't really steeped in Theosophical cosmology, that's okay. What I want you to take away from this is a view of time that is really hard to put our heads around. But it also brings us back to a point, this point right here, that says, oops, something's changing right now. We've got to do something about it. So see this S, where this S is, that's where all of a sudden we're transitioning from becoming more and more material and heavier to more and more lighter and spiritual. And so this is our time. This is a time to do something. And so in this long view of humans evolving in this fourth globe and the fourth round and the fifth root race within all these yogic cycles and this big, Manvantara of, cyclic time, oh my gosh, what do we do about that? And it changes our view of time, because it's now within this law-like emergent sort of structure where the future is not only unknown but can't be known. We're not even equipped to know what the fifth globe is going to be like. And our view of the future of humanity as being more ethereal and less physical and more collaborative and spiritual is something that seems so far away, and yet we're at this transition point, and that becomes, I think, our purpose. So, partial answer to some of my questions about what is the future of humanity and what is our relationship with the future and with time is being on the path. Now, what does that mean, to be on the path? Well, in The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky says, starting upon the long journey, the pilgrim, having struggled through and suffered in every form of life and being. So we've been doing this, we've been evolving a lot, thousands and thousands of times. But we're only at the bottom of the valley of matter. So we're at that turning point. And half through his cycle, when he has identified himself with collective humanity, that's part of where we're going here, is how do we identify with collective humanity? It is the martyrdom of self-conscious existence. He has to sacrifice himself to himself in order to redeem all creatures, to resurrect from the many into the one life. Okay, so there's the answer to the future of humanity. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Easy, right? These are really, we're going to come back to some of these words, but I want to emphasize again this notion of sacrificing self to self, and this action orientation in order to redeem all creatures, to resurrect from the many into the one. So Clara Codd talks about in the technique of the spiritual life that it is our destiny, and it is the destiny of each of us that one day we must learn to plunge into the mysterious depths of our own glorious being, for only there is to be found true wisdom and the real power to help. And again, power to help. So what she's saying here partly is what becomes important in our future is knowing ourselves. It's the destiny that we need to know and find the true wisdom in order to help others. So she talks about, to understand the technique of this great road, we must understand ourselves and the constitution of our souls, and also try to glimpse the person we really are. And she doesn't mean personality in a small p. She means large, capital E, ego. This chart is an interesting chart because this was actually published in the Theosophist in 1882. And Blavatsky separated the sevenfold dimensions of the humans into just body, soul, and spirit. And where we are is in this sort of soul, level where we're working on the mental and trying to push up to develop our Buddhic minds. And again, I apologize for those of you who aren't steeped in theosophical literature, but I think it helps to separate, and I do this all the time with when I'm thinking about things, I think about body, whatever I'm thinking about, from the perspective of body, emotions, what I know about it, a knowing, and then sort of a higher mental, how that reaches and starts to push up towards wisdom. And those dimensions really help me untangle a lot of problems. Even flipping the guy off driving when you're driving, there's a physical emotion, a reaction, there's an emotional reaction, then there's I think this, and then there's sort of a wisdom dimension. So part of the evolutionary path is understanding this complexity of who we are and learning to use all of those. So this isn't about navel staring. It's not just about developing meditative techniques that allow us to reach nirvana. It is about enacting all of these on our evolutionary path. Now, I'm only showing this, of course, this is Blavatsky's sevenfold nature perspective from The Secret Doctrine, and I don't expect you to really be able to delve into that too much, but it is interesting when you consider it, that you do see sort of a common monastic time, the everyday psychological time created by desire and the lower mind. And this is where we experience our hopes and our fears and our desires. There's a higher monist time, the abstract mind's perception of time, which begins to transcend ordinary psychological time. So this is getting away from, as Krishnamurti said, how you're trapped in psychological time and it fragments your soul. And so you're transcending that in the higher manas, where you start to perceive larger cycles and patterns of consciousness. So whether we understand those huge cycles or not, if you start to sort of see things in that kind of perspective, it changes how you operate from day to day, I think. Buddhic time, this is at this level, the psychological time begins to dissolve into this sort of eternal duration. This relates to intuitive wisdom and transcends sequential thinking. This is actually, it took me a long time to understand that when Krishnamurti uses the word intelligence, this is what he means. He doesn't mean knowledge, intelligence. That's more like the higher manas. But this intelligence is at this Buddhic level. So here we are in this earthly existence, and we've been in this earthly existence many times. And again, to complexify our ideas about time, you have your life with your particular dharma based on your past lives, your purpose, what we're supposed to be doing in this lifetime. Then you die, you go through kama loka, you go through this gestation state, you go to devachan, and then you do it again. And you do it again and again and again. And this, by the way, Borboka is the one who kind of describes this in his version of the Mahatma letters. So again, how we act now does affect how we will act and need to act in future lifetimes. So being on the path really is this development of intuition, an insight, discernment, discrimination, and intelligence in Krishnamurti's sense, the ability to differentiate between the real and the unreal, the good and the bad, the right and the wrong, the wisdom to distinguish between true self and the personality. So as Clara Codd was saying, we need to know ourselves. We need to distinguish these different layers of ourselves, but we need to still operate within all of those layers and use them together. Now, Jeffrey Hodson talks about the time arrives in human evolution when this thrust of spirit or the call and pressure of the awakened monad ego so affects the personal man that he experiences both dissatisfaction with existing limitations and aspirations to peaks of higher achievement. This is the calling. This is the seeking. This is what many of us have experienced, where all of a sudden it's like there's got to be something more. There's got to be something that we should be doing. And so this goes back to the idea of knowing ourselves and then being awakened to this path. And then when you're awakened to this path, the slowness of progress and paucity of attainment irk awakened man. Because when you think about, okay, we're going to do this how many more times? How many more lifetimes? Can't I just finish it in this lifetime? Do I have to really do this again and again? It becomes difficult because you're on the path. There's no going back, but that path is going to go on and on for a while. Krishnamurti talked about in The Future of Man, this idea of when you're developing this wisdom, when you're developing this intelligence, you can't ignore the physical, emotional, and mental capacities in this world. And they are vital to our continuing on this path. And this goes back also to the idea of what is our role as Theosophists to help others on this path. So what havoc has knowledge played, he says? Has it any place at all in the transformation of man? We have to understand, not intellectually, not verbally, but deep down in our being, the nature of our consciousness. Again, That's what Clara Codd was saying. And then in Voice of the Silence, HPB says, as the um, aspirant says, teacher, what shall I do to reach to wisdom? Wise one, what to gain perfection? And the answer comes, search for the paths. But oh, Lanu, and Lanu is like aspirant, be of clean heart before thou startest on thy journey. Before thou takest thy first step, learn to discern the real from the false, the ever-fleeting from the everlasting. Learn above all to separate head learning from soul wisdom, the I from the heart doctrine. So developing that wisdom, ethical action, mental spirit. Krishnamurti in Ravi Ravindra's book about Krishnamurti, he says that Krishnamurti really separated this notion of thought and action and spirit, and not separated them, but used them as an important part of the awakening of the intelligence. So getting beyond thought and time and freedom from one's own tyranny still requires this operation at a physical, mental level. I'm going to skip forward for a minute because I want to get to some discussion. In the introduction to Clara Codd's Spiritual Path, she said, the time is now. And so remember that view of the fourth globe from the Mahatma letters and how that axis goes through it. And it's like, that's where we are. And she says, humanity is a day's march nearer home. The new age dawning now will see the growth of the principle of cooperation. This is the Aquarian age. The growth will be brought about by growing consciousness of humanity. And man is passing from the idea of God transcendent to the thought of God immanent. What she means by that, and she goes at great lengths to talk about how the answers are inside. And so part of how we learn to discern who we are, and as we introspect about who we are as humans, that God power is within us. And we have the ability to make these discernments. So she talks about knowledge of self. And by the way, I had AI do this image for me. I fed in a part of Clara Codd's book chapter, and I said, make an image of this. And I thought this was really pretty good. So knowledge of self, obtain knowledge of the depths of our own glorious being, that we live several levels of consciousness at the same time. This knowledge is not given to us. It is already within us. It's immanence of God. Ego, or reincarnating self, is connected to the spirit in us, which provides spiritual wisdom. And our work of spiritual transformation, and it can be guided by our three objects. So where are we? Okay, here's the crib sheet answers, more or less. And then you can decide if these are the answers. I usually don't give the answers, but part of what I want you to get out of this presentation is, what is time? Well, it's complicated. And, we have cyclical time, we have illusory time, we have recursiveness, we have relational time. And actually, we have all of these kinds of time. How do our conceptions of time shape our reality and actions? Well, we know that to a certain extent already, but especially from a theosophical perspective, I think our conceptions of time shaping our reality puts us on the path as we explore these ideas. I think that's beginning the beginning of the insight of the development of the Buddhi mind. So why and how do we prepare for the future? I like Clara Codd's notion that wisdom and real power to help. So developing wisdom, but it's not about my wisdom. It's not about what it does for me. It's about how we help humanity as a whole. So the theosophical perspectives of time are very much related to the Hindu perspectives and ideas like dharma, reincarnation, and pathways to that, I think, are the three objects: meditation, developing the higher mind, but not forgetting, and that's why the three objects, the roles we play with other people. And what is the future of humanity from a cosmic perspective? That's really hard. But the question is, what about now? So what is the future of humanity? Well, here's one future, and I have to thank Sheila and Paul for this, because they brought this up in a previous conversation. 2025 is right here at the end of this Kali Yuga and entering into a 300-year period of strife and conflict. And so in our near future, I think we have a role to play in navigating, some of the conflict to come that we already, I think, are seeing. So if we were doing this in a workshop, I would ask you to draw a picture of how do you perceive human futures. I asked AI to do this. This was one image it came up with. Now I had to ask it a couple of times, but here we have the cyborg, which is sort of a mechanical thing, not necessarily even physical, and not biological. And then you have this very ethereal ET type person. I don't know, is that what we're going to become? I mean, when we're talking about long futures, we have to let go of the idea that our physicality is a part of who we are. Here's another image that AI came up with for me, whereas you become less materialistic and more ethereal, what's that like, and how does communication happen? So if now is the time, then I'm going to leave you with a few questions. So what does the eminence of God mean to you? What other trends suggest that humanity is moving toward greater awareness of divine eminence in everyday life and nature? What does it mean to already have the answers within ourselves? That's sort of one set of questions. On the path of spiritual journey, what has been your journey? How does it relate to the overall journey of humans? Was there a calling or an awakening for you? And then how do the three objects reflect a knowledge of self to the journey or to the path to enlightenment? And, the three objects, if you're not familiar with them in the Theosophical Society, I like very much that you have sort of the focus of universal brotherhood as very much of an outreach thing. You have encouraging the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science as a knowing, knowledge, expansion, mental thing, and the investigating the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man is very much a part of knowing who we are at our deepest levels. And so I'm going to end my slides. And just as another aside, I was doing a study for someone on Revelations, and this is the image the AI gave me on Revelations from the Bible. So I just wanted to share that too. I've been enjoying AI. So thank you for listening. I hope we can have some good conversation and open it up here. I know it's probably time for a break.